Nashville hummed with that thick July heat, the kind that made asphalt shimmer and turned car interiors into ovens by mid-afternoon. 1964 had been good to Jim Reeves. Better than good, actually. The kind of year that made a man feel untouchable. His voice, that smooth baritone that rolled like honey over gravel, had taken Welcome to My World to #2 on the country charts, and RCA Victor was already talking about another album, bigger distribution, maybe even crossover appeal into pop territory where the real money lived. At 40 years old, Jim had finally cracked the code that so many Nashville dreamers died chasing, that perfect balance between authentic country soul and commercial polish that made housewives in Ohio buy records and made promoters in New York return phone calls. Dean Manuel checked the fuel gauge on the Beechcraft Debonair for the third time that morning, his fingers drumming against the aluminum skin of the aircraft. 38 years old, licensed pilot since '57. Over 1,500 hours logged in single-engine planes just like this one. Dean wore two hats in Jim's operation, business manager during office hours and pilot whenever Jim needed to hopscotch between shows across Arkansas, Tennessee, and Texas. The Debonair, tail number November 8972. Mike represented 4 years of payments and careful maintenance, the kind of investment that said we made it without actually saying it out loud. Dean had flown this exact route, Batesville, Arkansas, back to Nashville, maybe 40 times before. Muscle memory stuff, eyes closed navigation. But that morning of July 31st, something sat different in Dean's chest, a tightness he couldn't name or shake. The pre-flight inspection took longer than usual. He rechecked the altimeter calibration twice, ran his palm along the pitot tube opening on the fuselage, made sure no insects had built nests in the static ports overnight. Jim watched from the small terminal building, signing autographs for a couple of teenage girls who'd somehow heard he was flying out. The girls giggled when Jim called them darling, their mother hovering nearby with a Kodak Brownie camera. Just another Friday afternoon in small-town Arkansas. The Debonair's maintenance logs showed a routine inspection completed 8 days earlier at Cornelia Fort Air Park back in Nashville. Oil change, spark plugs gapped, control surfaces checked for play. The mechanic who signed off, a guy named Porter with 23 years under his belt, had noted all systems nominal, in that efficient shorthand mechanics use, when everything checks out and there's nothing interesting to report. Porter would remember that signature differently years later, would tell a reporter from Aviation Week that he'd been rushed that day, 3 planes stacked up behind Reeves's Debonair, and maybe, just maybe, he'd skipped the full static system test because the plane had been flying fine all month, and sometimes you make assumptions that seem reasonable until they're not. Jim climbed into the right seat just after 2 in the afternoon, the sun already starting its slow western arc. Dean fired up the single Continental engine, that familiar whine and rumble that signaled transition from earth to sky. Batesville Tower cleared them for takeoff, runway 23, winds light and variable out of the southwest. The weather briefing that morning had called for scattered clouds, visibility unlimited, classic VFR conditions that pilots pray for. Visual flight rules, the kind of flying where you navigate by looking out the window instead of trusting instruments, where the horizon is your reference point and the ground below tells you everything you need to know. What the weather briefing couldn't mention really because the technology didn't exist yet to predict it with any accuracy, was the atmospheric instability building over Middle Tennessee. Not a storm exactly, nothing that would show up on radar or make forecasters nervous, but rather a peculiar layering of air masses that created pockets of reduced visibility, zones where haze and moisture conspired to erase the clean line between sky and earth. Pilots had a term for these conditions, called them sucker holes, patches of clear air that drew you in and then closed around you like a fist. Dean would fly straight into one approximately 3 hours and 18 minutes after wheels left Batesville asphalt. The Debonair disappeared from radar contact at 5:47 in the afternoon, roughly 40 miles south of Nashville Metropolitan Airport. The tower operator, a 26-year-old named Carlton who'd been working air traffic control for 3 years, noticed the blip fade from his scope and waited. Planes dropped off radar all the time in those days, especially single-engine aircraft flying low over hilly terrain, where the signal bounced weird off ridgelines and valleys. Carlton gave it 2 minutes, standard protocol, then keyed his microphone and called the tail number twice. Static answered back. He waited another 3 minutes, called again, then reached for the phone that connected him to the operations supervisor. What followed was a masterclass in bureaucratic confusion masquerading as coordinated search and rescue. The Civil Aeronautics Board got the notification at 6:12, 17 minutes after the Tennessee Highway Patrol received their call, which came 11 minutes after the Davidson County Sheriff's Office heard about it from someone at the airport who wasn't entirely clear on chain-of-command protocols. By the time 3 search aircraft launched from Berry Field at 7:33 that evening, the summer sun had already dropped below the horizon, and visibility had shrunk to whatever their landing lights could illuminate, which in dense Tennessee woodland amounted to maybe 200 feet of useful scan radius. They flew grid patterns over Williamson County for 3 hours, saw nothing but treetops and the occasional farmhouse light, returned to base at 10:48 with fuel tanks near empty, and nothing to report except frustration. Everett Benton heard the plane go down, or thought he did, couldn't be entirely certain about the exact moment, but knew it was somewhere between 5:30 and 6 because he'd been walking his property line checking fence posts before dinner, and the sun hadn't set yet. Everett owned 83 acres of mixed hardwood and pasture, about 6 miles southeast of Brentwood, land his father had bought in 1928 for almost nothing, and that would be worth a fortune 40 years later when developers discovered Davidson County. The sound that caught Everett's attention wasn't dramatic, wasn't the Hollywood explosion or screaming engine noise you'd expect. More like a sputtering cough, metal-on-metal grinding that lasted maybe 4 or 5 seconds, then silence heavier than the silence before it. Everett stopped walking, listened hard, heard crows take flight from somewhere northwest of his position. He thought about investigating right then, actually took a few steps in that direction, but the underbrush was thick, and he was 61 years old and dinner was waiting, and planes made weird noises all the time without crashing. He went home. That decision would haunt him in small ways for the rest of his life. The official search resumed Saturday morning at first light. 7 aircraft, now including 2 Tennessee National Guard helicopters, equipped with proper search and rescue. They expanded the radius to 75 miles, flew coordinates based on the Debonair's last known heading, and estimated fuel wreckage. Nothing. Sunday brought more of the same different pilots trading off in 4-hour shifts, covering the same ground from slightly different angles, hope slowly calcifying into grim acceptance that this was now a recovery operation, not a rescue. Weather stayed clear both days, visibility unlimited, the kind of conditions where you should be able to spot a white and red aircraft against green forest canopy, like a neon sign in a coal mine. Except nobody did. By Sunday evening, theories were already forming among the search crews, quiet speculation over coffee and cigarettes about how a plane that size could just vanish in an area that wasn't even particularly remote or mountainous. The breakthrough came Monday afternoon, not from professional searchers or sophisticated equipment, but from 2 local boys named Travis and Michael, who'd been riding dirt bikes through the woods near their subdivision. Travis saw the tail section first, that distinctive vertical stabilizer with November 8972, Mike still clearly visible, wedged between 2 oak trees about 30 feet off what passed for a trail in that part of the county. The impact site told a story that accident investigators would spend weeks interpreting and decades arguing about. The Debonair had come in at a steep angle, nose first, carving a 60-foot gouge through the canopy before slamming into earth hard enough to drive the engine block 4 feet underground. Both occupants died on impact, probably never knew what hit them according to the coroner's preliminary assessment, a small mercy in an otherwise merciless situation. But even in those first hours after discovery, details emerged that didn't quite align with the official narrative that was already forming. The wreckage pattern suggested a controlled descent gone wrong rather than a chaotic spin or stall. The wings had separated on impact but showed no signs of in-flight structural failure. Most puzzling was the altimeter, recovered intact from the instrument panel, frozen at a reading of 2,100 feet. According to tower records, Dean had reported his altitude as 1,700 feet during his last radio contact. 400 feet of discrepancy doesn't sound like much until you remember that 400 feet is the difference between clearing a ridgeline and slamming into it, between compensating for terrain and making assumptions that turn out to be catastrophically wrong. The Nashville Tennessean ran the story on Tuesday's front page, column inches usually reserved for politics or crime now dedicated to country music tragedy. Billboard magazine followed with a longer piece, chronicling Jim's career from obscure Louisiana disc jockey to international recording star, the kind of retrospective that makes death feel almost literary, like the end of a chapter that was supposed to have more pages. RCA Victor released a statement expressing profound sorrow and announcing that Jim's upcoming album would be released as scheduled, a tribute to his artistic legacy. The label didn't mention the contract negotiations that had been ongoing since April, the push and pull over royalty percentages and creative control that had grown increasingly tense over the summer. Those details would surface later, much later, when lawyers started reviewing files and asking uncomfortable questions about timing and motivation. The Civil Aeronautics Board released their preliminary findings 6 weeks after the crash, a 19-page document that boiled down to 3 words buried in paragraph 11: pilot spatial disorientation. The official conclusion painted Dean Manuel as a competent aviator who'd made a fatal error in marginal visual conditions, mistaking haze for horizon, trusting his eyes instead of his instruments, descending when he thought he was climbing. It was a neat explanation, the kind that wrapped tragedy in technical terminology and allowed everyone involved to file papers and move forward. Except the explanation required ignoring several inconvenient facts that didn't fit the narrative, details that experienced pilots noticed immediately, and that accident investigators would quietly debate in hangar conversations for years afterward. Dean Manuel had logged over 1,500 hours of flight time, with 237 of those hours specifically in the Beechcraft Debonair. He'd earned his instrument rating in 1959, which meant he was trained and certified to fly in conditions far worse than scattered clouds and reduced visibility. The weather data from July 31st showed ceiling heights above 3,000 feet and visibility measuring at least 5 miles across Middle Tennessee, hardly the soup-thick conditions that induce vertigo in experienced pilots. More troubling was Dean's recent flight history: 32 successful trips in the previous 4 months covering the same routes under similar or worse conditions without incident. Spatial disorientation typically claims low-time pilots or those unfamiliar with terrain, not seasoned aviators flying routes they could navigate half asleep. Larry Jordan spent 19 years investigating aircraft accidents for the National Transportation Safety Board before retiring to a small consulting practice in Oklahoma. In 2007, he received a call from a documentary filmmaker working on a project about unsolved aviation mysteries. The filmmaker wanted Larry's professional opinion on the Reeves crash, sent him copies of the original KAB report, weather data, and photographs of the wreckage. Larry spent 3 days reviewing the materials, made notes in the margins, then called the filmmaker back with an assessment that contradicted the official findings. This aircraft experienced a pitot static system failure, Larry said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd seen this pattern dozens of times. The altimeter discrepancy, the controlled descent profile, the fact that it happened in marginal VFR conditions, it all points to faulty instrumentation, telling the pilot he was higher than he actually was. When the filmmaker asked why the CAB hadn't reached the same conclusion, Larry paused for several seconds before answering. Because proving instrumentation failure requires extensive lab testing of recovered components, and sometimes, when the victims are high-profile and the insurance implications are massive, it's easier to blame pilot error and close the file. The financial picture surrounding Jim's final months added layers of complexity that the official investigation never adequately explored. RCA Victor had invested heavily in Jim's career, fronting money for studio time, promotion, distribution deals that pushed his music into markets where country traditionally struggled. By mid-1964, Jim's contract was up for renewal, and negotiations had stalled over royalty rates. Jim wanted 12% of wholesale industry standard for artists of his caliber. RCA's initial offer came in at 7.5%, a figure that insulted Jim enough that he'd quietly begun discussions with Decca Records and Columbia about jumping ship entirely. Music industry insiders knew that losing Jim Reeves would cost RCA millions in projected revenue, but keeping him at his asking price would set a precedent that other top-tier artists would immediately demand. The label faced a mathematical problem with no clean solution, the kind of bind that makes corporate accountants nervous and makes conspiracy theorists salivate. Documents that surfaced in estate proceedings during the 1970s revealed additional pressure points. Jim carried a $2 million life insurance policy naming his wife Mary as beneficiary, standard practice for successful entertainers whose families depended on income that could vanish with a car accident or heart attack. But Jim also carried a separate $1.3 million Keyman policy that paid out to a partnership entity involving Dean Manuel and two silent investors whose names were redacted in the publicly available documents. That policy had been increased from $500,000 just 8 months before the crash, a timing detail that raised eyebrows among forensic accountants who understand how insurance fraud works. Nobody suggested anything improper at the time, and probably nothing improper existed. But the optics were unfortunate enough that lawyers on both sides worked very hard to keep those details out of newspapers and away from curious reporters who might ask uncomfortable questions. Then there was the pattern, the statistical anomaly that becomes impossible to ignore once you see it clearly. Patsy Cline died March 5, 1963. Single-engine Piper Comanche. Pilot error attributed to poor weather decisions. Hawkshaw Hawkins and Cowboy Copas died in the same crash. 3 major country stars gone in one afternoon. Randy Hughes, Patsy's manager and the pilot of that doomed flight, had over 2,000 hours logged and an instrument rating. Yet the official report blamed spatial disorientation. 16 months later, Jim Reeves and Dean Manuel, same cause of death according to KB findings. Same questions about why experienced pilots suddenly forgot everything they knew about instrument flying. Jack Anglin died in a car accident March 7, 1963, 2 days after Patsy's crash, on his way to her funeral. Texas Ruby Owens, another country performer, died in a trailer fire December 29, 1963. 5 major losses in 18 months, a cluster that made actuaries nervous and made students of history wonder if country music had somehow become a statistically dangerous profession, or if something else was happening that nobody wanted to discuss in polite company. A mechanic named Porter, the same Porter who'd signed off on the Debonair's maintenance 8 days before the crash, told a different story 30 years later when he thought nobody was paying attention anymore. He was drinking in a Nashville bar in 1994, talking to someone he thought was just another aircraft mechanic swapping hangar tails. That someone turned out to be a freelance investigator working for an aviation safety group. Porter, 3 beers in, and feeling the weight of 3 decades of silence, mentioned that he'd been pressured to rush that final inspection. Not pressured by Jim or Dean, but by someone from the ownership group that held the note on the Debonair. Porter specifically remembered skipping the full pitot static system test because the equipment needed recalibration and would have meant grounding the aircraft for 2 additional days. "I told them the plane was probably fine," Porter said, his words slightly slurred but his memory sharp. "Probably isn't the same as definitely, but they needed it flying and I needed to keep my job." When the investigator tried to follow up with a formal recorded interview, Porter refused to go on record, said he'd been misunderstood, that the beer had been talking. He died in 2001, took whatever additional details he knew to wherever mechanics go when their tools finally rust. The internet changed everything about unsolved mysteries, transformed them from archived newspaper clippings, gathering dust in library basements, into living investigations where amateur researchers with too much time and surprisingly sharp analytical skills could crowdsource truth from fragments of data scattered across decades. Around 2012, a Reddit user with the handle Skyward Bound started a thread in the aviation mystery subreddit titled "The Country Music Curse: Statistical Analysis of 1963-1964 Fatal Accidents." The original post was dense, technical, filled with actuarial tables and NTSB database queries. But the core features were simple enough that it spread beyond aviation enthusiasts into true crime forums and conspiracy theory boards. 5 major country music artists died in transportation accidents within 18 months, a cluster that represented a fatality rate approximately 700% higher than baseline expectations for that demographic and time period. Skyward Bound wasn't claiming murder or sabotage, not explicitly, but the numbers raised questions that deserved answers beyond coincidence and bad luck. The thread attracted serious attention from people with actual credentials. A retired meteorologist named Douglas Chen spent 2 weeks pulling historical weather data from NOAA archives, specifically examining conditions on July 31, 1964 between 3 in the afternoon and 7 that evening across Middle Tennessee. Douglas's analysis, posted in a PDF that quickly circulated through aviation safety forums, concluded that visibility remained above 4 miles throughout the relevant time period, with cloud ceilings never dropping below 2,800 feet. These were not conditions that induced spatial disorientation in experienced pilots flying familiar routes. Douglas even found the original weather observation logs from Berry Field and documented that the KAB report had selectively quoted certain passages while omitting others that contradicted their pilot error narrative. When a Nashville newspaper contacted Douglas for comment in 2013, he stated plainly that the weather on the day Jim Reeves died would be considered excellent VFR conditions by modern standards, certainly nothing that would challenge a pilot with Dean Manuel's experience level. The statistical pattern became harder to dismiss once researchers started connecting dots that investigators in the 1960s either missed or chose to ignore. Between January 1, 1963 and December 31, 1964, the country music industry lost 8 prominent figures to sudden deaths, 5 in aircraft accidents, 1 in a vehicle collision, 2 in circumstances classified as accidental but suspicious enough to warrant second looks. That same 24-month period saw exactly 0 comparable losses in rock and roll, jazz, or pop music demographics. Elvis kept flying his private planes without incident. Frank Sinatra logged thousands of miles in chartered aircraft. The Beatles crisscrossed continents on commercial and private flights. But country music, a genre representing maybe 15% of the commercial music market at the time, absorbed losses that statistically should have been spread across the entire industry over a decade, not concentrated in one niche over 2 years. Insurance companies noticed this pattern too, quietly raising premiums for country artist life policies in late 1964, a business decision that suggested actuaries saw something in the numbers that official investigations had missed. The music industry insurance theory gained traction around 2015 when a financial journalist named Rebecca Thornton published a long-form investigation in a Nashville alt weekly. Rebecca had spent 8 months tracking down policy documents, interviewing retired insurance executives, and mapping the financial relationships between artists, management companies, and the labels that owned their contracts. What emerged was a picture of an industry in transition, moving from handshake deals and gentlemen's agreements toward corporate structures with complex insurance instruments designed to protect investments. Keyman policies, which paid out to companies when essential personnel died, had become standard practice by the early 60s. Rebecca documented at least 12 instances where label executives or management companies received insurance payouts exceeding $1 million following artist deaths between 1962 and 1966. She was careful to note that insurance payouts following accidental death are completely legal and don't suggest wrongdoing. But she also pointed out that sudden insurance wealth created perverse incentives in an industry already known for creative accounting and flexible ethics. The breakthrough discovery came in 2008, when the FAA released a batch of previously classified communication records under a routine declassification schedule. Buried in 3,000 pages of radio transcripts and tower communications was a partial recording of Dean Manuel's final radio contact with Nashville Approach Control. The official CAB report had characterized this exchange as routine position reporting, with no indication of distress or mechanical issues. But the actual transcript, fragmentary and degraded after 44 years in storage, told a different story. At 5:44 in the afternoon, 3 minutes before radar contact was lost, Dean transmitted, "Nashville Approach, Debonair 2 mic, showing unusual vibration in the panel, altimeter reading erratic, request vectors for precautionary landing." The transmission cut off mid-sentence, suggesting either radio failure or that Dean released the transmit button to deal with a more urgent problem. Nashville Approach responded twice asking for clarification. No response came back. The tower operator noted in his log, finally released decades later, that he'd reported the possible distress call to his supervisor, who told him to monitor the situation and file paperwork if the aircraft fails to arrive at destination within 30 minutes. That communication detail changed everything because it documented mechanical failure, pilot awareness of that failure, and an attempt to take corrective action. All facts that directly contradicted the spatial disorientation conclusion. Within weeks of the transcript's release, aviation forums exploded with activity. Pilots, engineers, and accident investigators who'd moved on decades ago suddenly returned to the case with renewed interest. A former CAB investigator, 79 years old and living in Florida, gave an interview to an aviation podcast in 2015, where he admitted that the Reeves investigation had been managed from above. Side, he wouldn't elaborate on what that meant exactly, wouldn't name names or point fingers, but he stated clearly that investigators on the ground had recommended further technical analysis of the pitot static system, and that recommendation had been overruled by senior officials who wanted the case closed quickly. When asked why, the old investigator said something that resonated across every conspiracy forum on the internet. Because sometimes the truth is expensive, and lies are cheap, and the people who make decisions care more about cost than they care about getting it right. The altimeter discrepancy, that 400-foot difference between Dean's reported altitude and what the recovered instrument showed, became the detail that wouldn't resolve no matter how many explanations people offered. If Dean had been relying on a faulty altimeter showing him 400 feet higher than reality, then his controlled descent made perfect sense. He thought he had clearance over terrain when actually he was aiming straight at a ridgeline he couldn't see through haze. That scenario fit all the physical evidence, explained the impact angle and wreckage pattern, and accounted for why an experienced pilot would fly into the ground without apparent evasive action. But accepting that scenario meant accepting that the maintenance inspection 8 days earlier had missed a critical instrument malfunction, or worse, that someone had deliberately tampered with the aircraft's altimeter system, knowing it would lead to disaster. Neither option reflected well on the industry, the regulatory system, or the investigation that followed. So the official story remained pilot error, spatial disorientation, tragic accident with no one to blame except a dead man who couldn't defend himself against allegations that his final moments had been spent confused and disoriented, when evidence suggested he'd known exactly what was wrong and had been trying desperately to fix it before time ran out. 3 theories coexist in the space where Jim Reeves died, each carrying enough evidence to be plausible, and enough gaps to remain unprovable. The first theory, the official one, says Dean Manuel became disoriented in marginal visual conditions and flew a perfectly good airplane into Tennessee hillside because his eyes lied to him about up and down. This theory requires believing that an experienced instrument-rated pilot with over 1,500 hours forgot his training at the exact wrong moment, ignored his instruments in favor of visual references that weren't there, and made no attempt to correct course even though he had minutes, not seconds, to recognize the problem. It's possible. Pilots have died this way before and since. But the weather data doesn't support it. The witness testimony contradicts it, and the recovered altimeter reading argues against it, with a precision that numbers rarely provide in accident investigations. The second theory centers on mechanical failure, specifically a compromised pitot-static system that fed Dean false altitude information during the critical final minutes of flight. This theory explains everything: the controlled descent profile, the lack of evasive action, the 400-foot altimeter discrepancy, Dean's final radio transmission mentioning erratic instruments. It accounts for why an experienced pilot would fly into terrain he couldn't see, because his instruments told him he had plenty of clearance when actually he was running out of sky. The weakness in this theory isn't technical, but procedural. Proving instrumentation failure requires laboratory analysis of recovered components, metallurgical testing, detailed examination of static ports and pressure lines. That level of investigation costs money and time, requires expertise that small aviation accidents rarely justify. The KAB in 1964 was understaffed and overwhelmed. They had dozens of crashes to investigate with limited resources. Blaming pilot error closed files efficiently. Pursuing mechanical failure opened them indefinitely. The incentive structure favored the quick answer over the right one. The third theory, the darkest one, suggests that someone wanted Jim Reeves dead, or at minimum didn't care enough about his survival to ensure his aircraft was properly maintained. This theory lives in the murky intersection of financial pressure, insurance incentives, and industry practices that looked normal in the 60s, but seem criminal under modern scrutiny. Jim was worth more dead than alive to certain parties. That's simply mathematical fact based on insurance policies and contract disputes. Dean Manuel, as business manager and pilot, represented both the executor of Jim's business interests and a convenient scapegoat if anything went wrong. The rushed maintenance inspection, the increased insurance policies, the pattern of country music deaths clustering in such a narrow window, all of it creates an outline of something ugly without quite filling in the details. Conspiracy theories fail when they require too many people staying silent for too long. But they succeed when they only require a few people looking the other way at the right moment, making small compromises that seem reasonable individually, but add up to catastrophe collectively. The crash changed regulations, At least that much good emerged from tragedy. The Federal Aviation Administration, which had only been created 6 years earlier in 1958, tightened maintenance requirements for commercial aircraft operations. Pitot-static system testing became mandatory at specific intervals, regardless of whether problems had been reported. Insurance companies revised their actuarial models for entertainer life policies, adding clauses about aircraft travel, and required safety standards. The National Transportation Safety Board, established in 1967 partly in response to high-profile accidents like Reeves and Klein, brought more rigorous investigative standards to aviation accidents. None of these changes brought Jim back or answered the questions his death raised, but they probably prevented some future pilot from flying into terrain because his instruments lied to him about altitude. Jim's musical legacy outlived the controversy surrounding his death by decades, and will likely outlive everyone reading this by decades more. "Welcome to My World" became his signature song posthumously, played at weddings and funerals, covered by artists across every genre imaginable. RCA Victor released 4 albums of previously recorded material between 1965 and 1969, each one selling better than the last, as Jim's death transformed him from successful artist into legend. His final recordings, done in the months before the crash, showed a voice at absolute peak, a performer who'd mastered his craft so completely that technical perfection sounded effortless. The tragedy of Jim Reeves isn't that he died too soon, though he did. It's that he died right when he'd figured out how to be great, right when the years of practice and failure and learning had crystallized into something that would have defined country music for another generation if he'd lived to deliver it. A memorial stands today near the crash site in Brentwood, Tennessee, maintained by fans who weren't born when Jim died, but who found his music through their parents or grandparents and decided his memory deserved physical space in the world. The marker is simple, granite with bronze lettering, listing the date and the names and nothing about conspiracy theories or altimeter discrepancies or insurance policies. Just the facts that everyone agrees on. 2 men flew into these woods on July 31st, 1964, and didn't fly out. Visitors leave flowers occasionally, guitar picks, handwritten notes thanking Jim for songs that shaped their lives. Nobody leaves notes demanding the truth about what happened. Nobody scrawls conspiracy theories on the memorial stone. There's something about standing in the actual place where someone died that makes the unanswered questions feel less urgent than the loss itself. Mary Reeves, Jim's widow, lived another 35 years after the crash, died in 1999 having never remarried or spoken extensively about that day beyond what lawyers required for estate proceedings. In a brief interview given to a Nashville historian in 1996, Mary said something that might be the closest thing to truth anyone will extract from this story. "I always knew there was more to it than what they told us," she said, her voice still carrying traces of the accent she'd grown up with in East Texas. "But knowing there's more and being able to prove it are different things, and at some point you have to decide whether you're going to spend your life chasing answers or living with the questions. I chose living." She was asked if she thought Jim's death was truly accidental. Mary paused for almost 15 seconds, long enough that the interviewer thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said, "I think a lot of people made choices that seemed small at the time, and those small choices added up to my husband being dead. Whether that's murder or negligence or just bad luck depends on your definition of those words." Other cases followed the pattern. Other artists who died in circumstances that raised more questions than investigations answered. Otis Redding's plane went down in December 1967 in Wisconsin. Pilot error attributed, though the weather was clear and the pilot was experienced. Lynyrd Skynyrd's chartered Convair crashed in October 1977 in Mississippi. Fuel exhaustion blamed, though the plane had been properly fueled before departure. Stevie Ray Vaughan's helicopter hit a ski slope in August 1990 in Wisconsin. Pilot error again, though visibility was adequate, and the pilot knew the terrain. Each investigation concluded with neat explanations that satisfied legal requirements while leaving pilots and engineers quietly skeptical. The pattern suggests either that talented musicians are disproportionately unlucky when it comes to aviation, or that the entertainment industry has never fully addressed systemic problems with how artists travel and who's responsible for ensuring their safety versus managing their schedules and maximizing their earning potential. The uncomfortable truth that emerges from 6 decades of hindsight is that some accidents never receive complete investigation, not because investigators are incompetent, but because complete investigation serves no one's interests. Artists want to keep flying because touring is how they make money. Labels want artists flying because scheduled appearances generate revenue. Insurance companies want to pay claims and move on because protracted litigation costs more than settlements. Regulatory agencies want to close files because open investigations tie up resources without guaranteed returns. The families want answers but also want peace, want to believe their loved ones didn't die because someone cut corners on maintenance or pressured a pilot to fly in marginal conditions or valued money over human life. So the official story gets written in language that sounds authoritative and conclusive, and the questions get buried in archives where only obsessive researchers and internet sleuths bother to look. And the pattern continues because fixing the system would require admitting the system was broken in the first place. Jim Reeves died on a Friday afternoon in July, and whether he died because of pilot error or mechanical failure or something darker involving insurance money and corporate interests probably doesn't matter to anyone listening to Welcome to My World on their car radio 60 years later. The music survived. The voice that rolled like honey over gravel still sounds alive when you close your eyes and let it fill the space around you. That's the only immortality anyone gets, the only justice available when official investigations fail, and conspiracies remain unprovable and time keeps moving whether we have answers or not. Jim's final recordings play on classic country stations, get streamed by people who don't know his story, get covered by artists who weren't born when he died. The songs outlived the man, outlived the mystery, and will probably outlive the truth if that truth ever surfaces from whatever archive or conscience it's been hiding in for the past 6 decades.